everyone. Thank you for taking time out of your busy days to be here for today's briefing of Failing Grade, how school voucher programs are failing to provide students with equitable opportunity. I'm Sasha Pudelski with the AASA, the School Superintendents Association, and I also have the privilege of co-chairing the National Coalition for Public Education, which is the oldest and largest coalition of national education, civil rights, religious, secular, and disability organizations that fight on Capitol Hill to keep public dollars in public schools and oppose all efforts to privatize education funding. The focus of our briefing this afternoon is on the just released GAO report titled Private School Choice, Federal Actions Needed to Ensure Parents are Notified About Changes in Rights for Students with Disabilities. And this report would not have been possible without Representative Mark Cohen and Representative Gwen Moore and Representative Marcia Fudge, who requested this report and ensured that GAO could do a thorough investigation of state voucher programs and look in particular at how they were serving students with disabilities. And if you have taken a look already at the findings of the report, we have some copies up front about what GAO's found in case you don't have time to read the lengthy report. You'll see that the findings demonstrate that the questions that Representative Cohen and his colleagues have asked GAO were really important to answer, particularly in this political climate. So the new GAO investigation revealed the extent to which parents who participate in school voucher programs understand the educational opportunities their children are being offered, and also understand the extent to which they're walking away from some very valuable services and protections when they leave the public school and go to a private school setting with a voucher. Specifically, today's briefing is going to focus on the findings that pertain to students with disabilities, who GAO finds are particularly harmed by the lack of accountability and transparency in school voucher programs. Just a few housekeeping notes before we get started, and I introduce our esteemed panel. We'll be using the hashtag VoucherFail. It's one word, VoucherFail. So if you want to participate along with us on social media, or if you want to just comment on what you're hearing, feel free to join us on Twitter for that conversation. And in addition, this event is being streamed on AASA's Facebook page. So if you have colleagues who couldn't make it today, because it's a very, very busy day on the Hill, but want to watch it later, it'll be archived and they can check it out or watch it at their desks right now. So with that, let me introduce our panel. To my left is Sarah Cohen from the American Federation of Teachers. And Sarah is an assistant director in government relations at AFT, where she's been a federal lobbyist since 2011 and is instrumental to the work that NCPE does in fighting voucher programs on Capitol Hill. And the American Federation of Teachers represents 1.7 million members, pre-K through 12th grade teachers, paraprofessionals, higher education and early education professionals, nurses, healthcare workers. And prior to working at AFT, Sarah worked in a second grade classroom, and she was also a Hill staffer. And to her right is, left rather, is Lindsay Jones from the National Center for Learning Disabilities. And Lindsay is the Vice President of Chief Policy and Advocacy Officer for the National Center for Learning Disabilities, or NCLD. And the mission of NCLD is to improve the lives of the 1 in 5 children and adults nationwide with learning and attention issues by empowering parents and young adults and transforming schools and advocating for equal rights and opportunities. And before joining NCLD, Lindsay was the Senior Director for Policy and Advocacy with the Council for Exceptional Children and started her career as an attorney who advised schools and parents on special education compliance. And to her left is Matt Braun, a research associate from the Center on Education Policy at George Washington University. And the Center on Education Policy is a national independent source for research and information about public education. And Matt is the author of a new report called Little Evidence and Big Consequences, Understanding Special Education Voucher Programs. And prior to working at CEP, Matthew worked with the Education Trust and in the DC Public Schools. So thank you for joining us. And before we begin, I want to just provide a little more context to the GAO report that was just released. The report examines 3 distinct issues. First is the academic, administrative, and financial accountability mechanisms in state voucher programs. The second is the information available to the public and to prospective parents on voucher programs and the participating private schools within them. And the third is how parents of students with disabilities are informed about changes in rights when enrolling in school voucher programs. GAO analyzed information from all voucher and ESA programs operating as of January 2017 and interviewed officials from the Department of Education, national groups, and experts. And they also reviewed 344 websites of private schools that were participating in the voucher programs, which is a nationally representative sample, and conducted extensive interviews with private school administrators, voucher program administrators, parents and families who used vouchers. And then took a deep dive into 6 voucher programs in 5 states, which serve roughly 2/3 of all kids in voucher programs. And they really examined their operations, accountability, and transparency. And so this is a really comprehensive investigation that GAO conducted. And then a note of clarification, GAO looked at 2 different type of voucher programs. They looked at a traditional voucher program, which is in 23 out of 27 programs. And those are considered programs where the state gives money directly to parents that they can then apply to a private school tuition for the school that's participating in the voucher program. But they also looked at something that's a little different called an education savings account voucher, or ESA. And that's where the state sets aside the pupil funding that they're normally going to apply to a public school, and instead puts it in a savings account that a parent can draw down during the school year or before the school year, and use for private school tuition as well as other educational expenses. It can even consist of homeschooling costs. In some cases, it can consist of therapies or tutoring the child might need. And so they looked at 4 of those programs as well. So now that you have a sense of the scope of GAO's work as well as some of the terminology, I'm going to kick things off by talking with our panel. So, Sarah, let's start with you. What findings caught your eye in the report regarding taxpayer accountability for voucher programs?
Hi, everyone. So the first thing that really struck me when I looked at the report was that how timely it is. So GAO started doing this investigation, I think it was last year, and so I'll just say before the Betsy DeVos confirmation hearing. And if you all think back to that confirmation hearing, one of the real flashpoints there was when she was speaking with Senator Hassan about rights for students with disabilities when they use vouchers. And so that's a lot of what this report talks about. And for anyone who's sort of new to the issue, there's actually a great explanation in there about what it is, what the rights are that students are giving up when they take a voucher to go to a private school, and there's also a handy chart on it, so I do recommend that. But I think that generally it is clear that that is an aspect of voucher programs that haven't received as much attention, and it wasn't as well understood as a lot of the other pieces. So I think it's a really timely report. In terms of the accountability generally, you know, Sasha noted that GAO looked at traditional voucher programs and also at education savings accounts. They have a note in there that they did not include some other voucher-like programs, such as tuition tax credits and statewide tuition tax deduction programs. And the reason is because there is such a dearth of information on those programs that they couldn't even be included in this review. So when you're looking at their findings in terms of what accountability oversight mechanisms exist, know that this is sort of the best case scenario because they didn't even include the programs where there is no information in many ways. And I think even with that, even though this is best case, there are still wide gaps. And Sasha talked about the 3 areas that GAO looked at. And there are sort of gaps in all of those areas. And then again, in terms of this as being best case, we know from, for example, GAO reports about the DC voucher program that just because a requirement exists doesn't mean that it's really being followed or implemented well. So I just, want to say, like, we see huge holes that this report has shown in terms of gaps in oversight and accountability mechanisms, and that's just the best case scenario. And I think this handout, hopefully you guys picked it up. This is no editorializing, this is just cut and paste from the GAO report. And I think it's a really helpful snapshot of their findings in terms of for the 3 types of accountability that they were looking at, and then some information about what information was or was not being given to parents with disabilities. So I just, in case people don't have time to read the whole report, you can get a bit of a summary there. And you know, as I just said, you know, GAO has found in other programs like DC Voucher Program that just because a requirement exists doesn't necessarily mean it's being met. And GAO found that here as well, that private schools seem to have mixed experiences in implementing, for example, the testing requirements. And so, you know, maybe they weren't familiar with or didn't have the capacity to really administer these tests, even though it was required.
Sarah, can I cut you off just right for a second? Because we are being joined by someone very special, Representative Cohen Moore. And as I mentioned earlier, she is one of the 3 members of Congress who requested this very important report. And Congresswoman Moore was elected to represent Wisconsin 4th Congressional District in 2004, making her the first African American elected to the Congress by the state of Wisconsin. And she was also elected recently to serve in leadership in the Congressional Black Caucus as the caucus whip, and has been just an ardent supporter of initiatives that put low-income students on a path for success, whether that's supporting child nutrition programs or the TRIO programs, of which she is actually a beneficiary. She is just a fantastic advocate for public schools and always been a staunch opponent of voucher programs, particularly the one that exists in her backyard, which is the oldest voucher program in the country, the Milwaukee Voucher Program. And so it's an honor to have her here today just to share a few of her thoughts on the report.
Thank you all for gathering here, and I don't want to take a whole lot of time, but I do want to bring you greetings from Mark Cohen, who is recovering beautifully in Wisconsin, and Marsha Fudge, who was another one of our colleagues who joined us on this effort. As you mentioned, Milwaukee is home to the oldest voucher program in the country, and so it was very difficult for me to escape discussions about the efficacy of these programs and what they do and do not do. I think that this experiment has gone on long enough for the GAO to have come up with some extremely important findings to strengthen public education, because no matter whether it's a voucher program, charter school, the bottom line is that the public is always being asked to divvy up to pay for the results. And that was one of the things that always concerned me about the voucher program in Milwaukee, is that at whatever point those services collapse, public school teachers were always there, expected to pick up the pieces without necessarily the funding to go on. So I'm real interested in hearing about the key report findings of the GAO report, and really looking at what we can do to strengthen public education going forward. I do think that we are probably in a situation, when you consider the appointee that is currently in the Department of Education and the current administration, we're probably in a situation where we, it's not realistic at this point to talk about ending voucher programs. But that being said, it's imperative for us to figure out how, in this matrix of educational programming, that we don't leave our students behind. And we don't leave disabled students behind. We don't leave children of color behind. We don't leave girls behind. And we don't have parents wondering whether or not they have done the right thing in terms of making choices about their children. We value professional teachers, and so we are very interested in hearing about how alternative credentialing for teachers is working out for our kids. And so I'm excited. Excuse me for being a little bit late. I am the ranking member on the Monetary Policy and Trade Subcommittee of the Financial Services Committee. all that whole title means that I don't have any power, but we're talking about sanctions, our sanctions programs that are under the Department of Treasury, and so I had to be there for that. So thank you very much, and I'm eager to hear what you're going to say.
Thanks again. So Sarah, we were talking a little bit about the accountability provisions within these programs, and I know GAO looked at testing accountability, and they also looked at things that go well beyond testing, like school quality measures that we have in AASA, financial accountability, for example, whether teachers are qualified to be teaching. What can you tell us about what they found in those models?
Yeah. So again, I'll just start with my larger observation, which was, what they considered basically to be administrative accountability. I think are a lot of items that parents take for granted are going to be there, and they might not even know to ask about it, right? So for example, GAO found that most programs, could even say almost all programs, require participating private schools to comply with state and local health and safety standards. But that's not all, right? That's most. And so I don't think it's an unreasonable expectation if you're a parent using public funds to put your child in a school to assume that that school is meeting basic health and safety standards. Some other of their findings is that only half of voucher and ESA programs require the private schools to conduct background checks on their employees. About 2/3 require the private schools to employ teachers and other staff with specific qualifications or credentials. So what that means is they found that less than half of the programs require teachers to have a degree and or a state teaching license. Similarly, only about half of programs require paraprofessionals or specialists to have specific qualifications or certifications. So that's some of the administrative pieces. And then on the fiscal oversight, just half of the programs would require fiscal soundness in order to participate, and less than 1/3 of the programs, so less than 1/3 of the programs, which actually represent fewer than 1/4 of the students participating, require annual audits on the financial side. So GAO did find a program where they talked to program officials that told them they would prefer to have the authority to remove private schools with financial issues, but they didn't have that power because of the way their program was set up.
Wow, that's really shocking. So we're talking about private schools that are receiving taxpayer dollars, and they don't have to report publicly the test scores of kids, so we don't know if they're improving academically. They don't have to have teachers with bachelor's degrees. They don't have to have teachers who have passed criminal background checks. They don't have to demonstrate that they can be accountable for the dollars they're receiving through common accounting practices. So what information are parents being given then? My understanding is that these administrators typically in states provide some sort of directory of the private schools with the name of the private school, maybe where it's located, so parents can see how far away it is from their house. And then, is there more information that they can use to judge the quality of the school in the directory itself?
So, right, what GAO found was that, parents often will use various sources of information, right? Everyone can Google. But that the program administrator usually has some sort of directory of participating schools with basic information. But that, then people they go to maybe the school's website themselves to try to find information. And a lot of schools, again, both the programs and the schools themselves are not providing a lot of information. So for example, fewer, most have contact info, but few of them have, for example, graduation rates. Fewer of them are going to tell you whether the school is accredited, which means that the student who graduates from the school can get a diploma that's accepted by the higher education institutions of their state. For example, only 3 of the 15 programs designed for students with disabilities actually have specifically tailored information on their website for families of students with disabilities. I do want to back up a minute to the larger accountability piece that I forgot I meant to mention earlier, which is actually, if you look at their findings, the way GAO did their charts, they actually break it out between voucher programs generally and voucher programs that are geared towards students with disabilities. And if you look at it, what really jumps out is that there is even less accountability and oversight mechanisms for the programs that are geared towards students with disabilities than there are for the programs generally. And so just, you know, my last thought on some of these oversight, like you were asking about some of what, you know, GAO calls the administrative ones, the ones that might not be clear, right? So if a parent signs up for a voucher program, even if it doesn't say on the website, they are pretty clearly early on going to figure out whether there is a transportation issue, right? But there are some things, like I said, that are hidden. They might not know whether the teachers are certified correctly. There's also something like accreditation. I think even when you're an education policy person, that might not occur to you because you sort of take it for granted. And we actually heard from a family earlier this year, a family of a student who was using a voucher in Florida. And he was a top student. He went to junior high and 9th grade with the voucher, and then he wanted to transfer to the public school for high school. And that's when his family found out that his school had not been accredited. And so he was told he was going to have to repeat 9th grade, and he didn't want to because he had been a top student and he'd already done 9th grade. So here you had someone who had been a top student who became effectively a high school dropout because he didn't want to have to repeat a grade he had already done. And when the family called the program administrator, they basically said, well, it was the responsibility of the parent to know to ask the school if they were accredited or not, and they didn't feel like that was their role at all to let parents know. So those are the types of things that can have a real impact on students and families, and they're just not being given the information.
Yeah, and this is also an issue of accreditation that came up when we had the reauthorization of the DC voucher program, where one of the things that was talked about a lot was how many of the programs that we're federally funding here through DC's voucher program don't also guarantee that a child walks away with a diploma that will be accepted by an institute of higher education. So Lindsay, thank you for joining us today. I want to get your reaction to what GAO found in terms specifically of what Sarah referenced, access to information for parents of children with disabilities. What are they seeing within these directories, as well as when they actually look at the websites? Because GAO did a pretty comprehensive examination of the websites themselves.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you, Representative Moore, who can, Representative Fudge, for requesting this information. I think, we did our own study earlier this year at the National Center for Learning Disabilities because we represent parents and families of children who have learning disabilities. And there's been a great proliferation in these programs, which the report points out, since 2006. So we've had more and more parents and families coming to us and asking questions about them or telling us stories about their interactions with them. The report, the most striking concern we have, I'd actually say there's three, but they're all really linked. The first is, when you take your child out of a public school and they have a disability, when you put them in a private school, you give up all of their rights to our federal law, Individuals with Disabilities and Education Act. You would do that if you were a parent who took your child and put your child in a private or parochial school without a voucher, and you would do it also if you used a voucher or education savings account or tax incentive, any private school. So most of the concern we see here is that parents don't know that they're giving up those rights. And that's sort of that's twofold, right? If you have a child with a disability who's already been identified, you may be used to those rights and their regular meetings with the school, information about where your child's being placed, if their placement's changing, if anything about their education is changing. You have a lot of say and you get a lot of information. You may just be used to that, just as you would assume that maybe your school is going to be accredited or you wouldn't think to ask. So you wouldn't necessarily think those things go away. A lot of parents are surprised to find out that they're gone. Additionally, the second concern with that particular thing is these are public dollars and they're being given without rights that typically we would assume would travel with that funding. So that's our first and biggest concern, is that parents don't have good information about the rights that they're giving up. And in fact, it was shocking when we looked at all 64 of these types of programs, and by that I mean vouchers, education savings accounts, and what we could find about tax incentives. The lack of information for parents about what is out there is really very stark. I was a practicing attorney. I'm a recovering attorney from many years ago. And so I fancy myself able to read a legalistic sentence, right? And when I got on some of these sites, we had a researcher actually conduct a report for us to try to read the language. We have one of the handouts outside, we just quote some of the language that is in a couple of these programs. It's unbelievably impenetrable. It's hard to understand, and it doesn't tell you very clearly what is happening. So to us, the concern there is the parent making a choice? Are they making an informed choice? So first of all, we're worried about the fact they're giving up rights. The second thing is it's clear, and the GAO report makes it even clearer, there's no good information that's being given to parents about what is the consequence of entering these programs. And the real consequence can be when you give up those rights, the first place it comes up is discipline. In many cases, you have a lot of rights as a person with a disability in a public school. If you have an incident with discipline, the public school has to do a small investigation and say, was the behavior that caused the discipline actually caused by the disability? And do we need to put more supports in place? Is it because there aren't enough supports? Or is that behavior not the result of the disability, in which case it should be subject to the discipline code? Obviously, that's not in private schools, and that's where we see one of the biggest kind of tensions there. The final thing is that we found, and this was reported also in the GAO report, are the sort of hidden costs that parents may not be aware of. So in one of the handouts you have out there, we just went to several states and determined what was your average voucher amount, or your state prescribed voucher amount, what's your average private school cost, and then the final column is for specialty schools for children with learning disabilities. So these are schools that are private schools, and some parents of means will choose to place their student in these schools. Sometimes public schools will place students at public cost in these schools. These are highly specialized schools providing very intense supports and services. So the average, let's just pick Arkansas or Florida, because it is one of the biggest ones. The average voucher is about $6,900. This average private LD school, the average school that is like the best private school for learning disabilities, is $14,200. In Georgia, that school is $25,000. In New York, it's $40,000. The voucher is basically functioning as, because the amount of the voucher is so low, it's functioning as a coupon for someone who's already made the financial decision that they can go to that school. So that brings a big concern to us as well, in that most parents we interact with, we run a website called understood.org with 14 great nonprofit partners. 2.2 million parents a month come to that website. Most of them are not able to afford $40,000 a year for a private school, let alone 20. So we're very focused on public schools and public systems, and the idea that the public money should be providing support to the most students that it can. So giving up learning, basically the requirement that they're waiving all of their rights under IDEA, not providing good information about that waiver and what it means, and then understanding the true cost of these and what it might mean for their family are our three biggest concerns, and all of those were echoed in the GAO report as well.
Wow. Yeah, that's really a shame that I mean, you're finding the same thing that GAO is finding, that these programs are just continuing to underserve kids, and I do think it's intentional. The fact that these websites are so hard to discern, the fact that is it intentional on the part of the administrators, the people who are designing these programs purportedly for students with disabilities, that these programs are set up this way?
I don't know that it's intentional. I actually think it might be, but I think there's a great amount of oversight in that. I think, I do think in most cases, most private schools aren't held to that standard, right? They don't have to provide that information, which is why the GAO's requirement that IDEA should do something. We should do something to make sure parents get this information so they can make that good decision. and understand the consequences of it, and not, in so many cases, as you saw with the 17 families that they interviewed here, parents talked about moving their kid from school to school because they weren't getting information and then something happened at the school and they have to go to another school. And so I think there's a general lack of understanding of what the rights are on the behalf of private schools. They're not used to putting out that information.
Right.
They wouldn't normally do it. Where I think I feel a little more culpability maybe is at the state level. States should be providing this information to parents. They provide that information routinely. The federal government should be providing that information to parents. According to, we use federal guidance all the time. There's not one piece of federal guidance that really talks about this. So I think there are levels of where we could be doing a lot better.
And related to that, I don't know if you noticed this, but originally GAO mentioned in their report that they went to the department and talked to them about issuing guidance. And the department seemed to say, we don't have the authority to issue guidance on this. What did you make of that?
I was shocked actually
Yeah,
to see that.
me too.
I was very surprised by that. I haven't spoken with them about that. I'd love to get a little more information about why that is. I mean, I look at a lot of their other guidance, and I guess I don't understand why they wouldn't be able. It seems like a perfect spot for them to be providing that.
Rather than wait for Congress, which is not going, IDA was last reauthorized in 2004, so, if we want something to be done, it has to be at least guidance at this point.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, Matt, let's loop you in here. So what do you think of what GAO found, and how does it align with your own recently conducted research on this topic?
Thanks for having me here. So my report examined the growth and characteristics of state special education voucher programs, and I identified some of the key and salient issues and concerns that have yet to be addressed by researchers and policymakers. Although my report exclusively focused on special education voucher programs and not education savings accounts, my findings were pretty much aligned with what the GAO report found. Specifically, parents are largely unaware that they're waiving their IDA protections when they utilize a voucher to send their child to a private school. Moreover, as the GAO report identifies, the services and supports that would be guaranteed to these students under IDEA are largely under the discretion of the voucher receiving private school. And this happens often without oversight or accountability. I think the GAO report really underscores how little parents, policymakers, and educational stakeholders really know about these programs.
And what about which kids with disabilities are eligible for this program? Lindsay kind of touched on how they did research at NCLD that found that the tuition rates don't match up with the scholarship amounts, but this idea that kids are trapped in these failing, segregated schools, they need an opportunity, they need a way out of poverty, is kind of the framing of voucher programs typically, and why sometimes even we see Democrats supporting them as a concept of moving kids and families out of poverty. How does that align with what you found as well, just in terms of eligibility for students with disabilities and generally?
So for special education voucher programs, they're all open to students who have an IEP. Beyond that, many states have additional eligibility criteria. For instance, Louisiana restricts eligibility to those who reside in a parish with greater than 190,000 residents. Florida, their McKay Scholarship Program allows students who qualify under Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 to participate. Wisconsin, they only allow students to participate if they have been rejected from the state's open enrollment system. And Utah, they extend the definition of disability to include those with developmental delays. When thinking about the types of students who utilize these programs, in my opinion, there's two large concerns. The first being the extent to which these programs disproportionately attract wealthy and non-minority students. And we don't really know very much about this. The only research that I was able to find comes from two sources. One is a 2008 Ohio report that examined their autism program, and they found that wealthy parents do use these vouchers more than non-wealthy parents. And then a 2003 report of McKay's scholarship program in Florida, which found that the percentage of minority children participating in their program was roughly equal to the racial composition of students who remain in the public system. The second area of concern is the extent to which these voucher receiving private schools favor students with mild disabilities and avoid enrolling those with the more serious disabilities. The research on this is also pretty scant. The only study that I was able to find that kind of dealt with this issue was the same 2003 Florida study that I just mentioned, which did find that students with the more severe disabilities were not underrepresented in Florida's program. In regards to both these issues of concern, I think it is worth emphasizing that the research is very dated and is limited to one specific program. We don't have any research that comprehensively looks at these programs.
So the idea that a student with a disability, perhaps a more significant disability, is being served or can be served, especially if they're a student of color or a student in poverty, in these programs, there's just no research to back up that that's actually happening. Wow. And so generally though, what can you tell me about the empirical research on these voucher programs writ large?
So the short answer is that we do not know very much. While much has been written about vouchers generally, only a few academic and empirical studies have examined special education vouchers. So what do we know? So the one main thing that we know is that parents who use vouchers to attend a private school tend to be more satisfied than those parents who remain in the public system. However, parental satisfaction is a crude measure, or can be a crude measure, to gauge the efficacy of programs due to inherent biases. Specifically, studies that use parental satisfaction tend to favor voucher programs, since those who use vouchers are already dissatisfied with the public system. Additionally, it is very important to stress that the majority of empirical research, like much of the research done on vouchers writ large, do not come from traditionally neutral sources. The empirical research typically appears in partisan publications and or is supported or written by institutions or organizations or individuals that have a kind of a ideological stance on either in for or against these programs. Much more independent and comprehensive research is necessary in order to make any definitive conclusion regarding these programs.
That's so interesting. So that just yesterday, EdChoice, which is one of the largest voucher advocacy organizations, released a survey and touting the parental satisfaction rates of people who use vouchers, no surprise, and who choose and use other forms of school choice programs. And again, you know, the source is one that, you know, anyone looking for a neutral source will not call them neutral, as they, you know, are very, just like I'm not neutral, are very, you know, fierce proponents of voucher programs. And so it's interesting that that's not the exception, that's more of the rule of thumb when we look at voucher research these days. Well, I want to open things up to the audience to see if there's any questions from anyone here. So give yourself a moment to think if you have anything, any questions for our panel. And if you do, yes?
My question is more just directed at Matt specifically, just because you mentioned how parent satisfaction is kind of a crude measure to make these assumptions. How can we change public support for public education in the minds of these parents?
You know, it's a very difficult question. I mean, when we're talking about students with disabilities, it's very hard to come up with a measure of satisfaction, a good measure to kind of think how to judge efficacy. Test scores, they don't do it because we're not interested in test scores when it comes to these types of students. Granted satisfaction might be the only measure that we do have, and it can be a good measure to use if it is employed with thoughtful design in mind. And I have seen studies that have done that, but not with special education voucher programs.
Matt, if I could just jump in 1 second. I think what you meant to say is that, you know, test scores are important, but there's so much more in terms of special education programming that is important. I know
they're pretty important.
Yes, I saw Lindsay like, whoa! And I know what you meant, so I just wanted to clarify that. Do you have any thoughts on that though, Lindsay? Because it is true that parents who are more likely to take a voucher are those who probably haven't had the best experiences in public schools, and then suddenly they have this other option, whatever it is, and they have skin in the game, as in they're paying for it, most likely to. So how does that impact these results?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's two ways that we can kind of think about this, and that's why we kind of looked at voucher programs that were for special education and not special and for anyone, because there is a pattern in special education, in students who struggle with learning, that sometimes, they will start to struggle in a school, and their parents and others will think, maybe it's the teacher's personality. It's, as everyone's trying to figure out what it is, especially for a kid with a learning disability, reading, writing, math, an indivisible disability. Maybe it's the school, maybe if I can put a different environment on them. And so that's where something like this can be very attractive, because you're looking to find something new. Now the concern is, when you sign away your rights, you now have given up your rights to an evaluation and other things. Evaluations are very expensive, and so in those cases, if the child they move the kid into a private school, still have these struggles, and now they've got to move back, either pay large costs to get evaluations, don't get as much information about it, and they have to go back to the public system for those things. You've got a real transition issue in that child's life. So that's a concern. But I think the other thing is, you see a state like Florida, many parents who have children with disabilities, they become advocates, whether they want to be or not, because they're in situations where they have to walk into a meeting with a group of people and talk about their kids' deficits, how they're going to handle them. It's a very emotional and challenging moment, and it's a difficult meeting, But it's interesting, in Florida's law, it's the only law that I've seen like this, but within 10 days of any IEP meeting, I'm sure you've seen this as well, the school has to give you notice that you have the right to use the McKay Scholarship. Many parents we talk to interpret that as, are you trying to kick me out? You don't want me in the school, I'm too expensive to serve. Why? I don't know that was the intention. It was probably written in years ago to give them information. It's having the opposite impact. And so I do think there's, in terms of public opinion, working around special education, there are those two. The best thing you can say to parents is, we want your child in this school. They deserve to be here. We're a school that serves everybody, and your child should be here. Because everybody wants to most people want to send their kid to the school down the street that's close to their house. They can get in their neighborhood and things like that. So I think the most important message to tell parents is that all children are welcome in public schools.
And I'll just, not as specific for students with disabilities, but I think also to just remember, when you're talking about vouchers and you're talking about parent satisfaction, right? I think in all things, when someone has made an active choice, they're more likely to be satisfied with that choice. And so when someone chooses to use a voucher, they're being proactive about something. So I think right there's probably some bias in terms of what the outcome is going to be. And then also I think even when you talk about, say, an individual family or individual people who've used vouchers who talk about their experience, there was a researcher who a couple years ago I thought said it really well. Like, if the research shows, for example, with academic outcomes, if the research shows that on balance there's no net difference in academic outcomes, that means for every person who's up there touting their great experience, there's someone who had an equally negative experience. But who wants to come forward and be like, I made a choice to use a voucher and actually it was the wrong decision for my child. I put them in a place that left them further behind. That's not something that people are particularly eager to recognize, to come forward, to make public, and so I think that's also may play a role here when you're talking about sort of satisfaction.
Absolutely. Yes?
Could you walk us through a little bit of what actually happens if the student is enrolled in a voucher school and finds out that it's not going to work, and they go back to the public school? What happens with the funding, and what's sort of the what follows there?
Well, the funding is lost if it's after the average daily attendance is taken for that school year. So typically school districts, there's a state law in every state that says on this date, let's say it's October 15th, we're going to, for purposes of state funding and federal funding, and we're going to find out how many kids you have and allocate resources accordingly. So if that kid, for example, starts out in a school voucher program and comes back to the school, say in November, because they're not happy with it, the district doesn't get any dollars for serving that child. We have this obligation, of course, to serve all children. who walk through our doors, and we just don't have resources to serve that child. If they're a child with a disability in particular, their costs are higher, so that means that there are usually weighted funding that goes along with that child in a state, and through IDEA, of course. And so we're losing out on more resources that can be used to serve that child in particular. And so that parent, as soon as they're unhappy with their experience within the private school, can leave and come back to the public school, and we'll have an obligation to provide them with an IEP, a learning plan. We have an obligation to ensure they're educated in the least restrictive environment. So if they were in a very segregated setting in their private school system, and that was one of the reasons they left, they can pretty much, be sure that that won't be the same case in the public school system, unless everyone agrees that that's okay. And so they have a preservation of rights, and Lindsay, you probably can talk more about that issue a little bit more because we didn't get into it as much, but if they're unhappy with the public school education that they're getting, they also have rights that could allow them to even go to a private school like one of the specialized schools that could really meet their needs better.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to point out, and I wanted to actually make a point about what you just mentioned in terms of segregation, but under IDEA, there is a least restrictive environment clause, right? So the school has to, the team of individuals has to say that we are trying to put you in the most inclusive environment we can with your gen ed peers to the extent we can and still be able to provide you services. And our public schools, by and large, right now, for children with learning disabilities, so this is reading, writing, math, they're spending 80% and more of their day in gen ed classrooms entirely. And that's a good thing. We have research to show it's good. Maybe in certain situations it's not working, but it is, by and large, a good thing for society. And so our public schools are the most inclusive environment there. Now, if the parent and the child, we know they are very specific and significant needs, they may need to be served in a separate setting. And the public school is obligated to pay for that environment if the team determines that that's the correct environment, or the parent has a right, this is what you were just pointing out, a parent has a right to say to the school, I don't believe you've provided the right environment. I believe this private environment is the correct one and you should pay for that. And there's a legal process by which the parent can try to prove that, and the school has a chance to respond. So there is a mechanism for parentally placed private school students. But there's a point here that I want to make that's publicly placed. Sorry, too many P's in that sentence. Publicly placed private school students. But the point I want to make is, a couple of years ago we heard, I think one of the things that's really challenging about this situation is the urgency of your child's education, right? Your child is moving through their education and you are concerned about what to do. And we hear great pressure about early intervention. If you don't get in early, oh my God, what will happen? And so parents, I think in many cases do, if something isn't working at the public school, feel pressure in that situation, and that may be something that leads them to look at these different settings. What a concern that we have at NCLD is if there are lots of settings, this school serves just children with dyslexia, this one serves just children with autism, this one serves just children with other significant cognitive disabilities. We are actually funneling and creating a segregated system, which is what IDEA was passed to stop. When IDEA was passed, it was passed because states had laws that made it illegal for kids with any disability to go to a public school. It was illegal for them to go to the school. So there were Supreme Court cases that said that can't stand. Our public schools must serve all children. And then IDEA was passed so that we could figure out how to do that. And we've made great strides. You just heard me say 80% of our students are spending most of their time in general education. They're going to be living with all of us, right? We live together. We need to prepare them for that world. So I'm a little concerned about some of the resegregation potential here that may come out of that urgent need parents feel, but not thinking, what have I done by pushing all students with disabilities out of this system?
Absolutely. And let me just really quickly, in case it's helpful, walk through basically the way IDEA works, right, is, as Lindsay has been talking about, that there are rights that come for students with disabilities. So that includes an individualized education program, an IEP. Part of the requirement of the IEP is that the parents are part of the conversation and the decisions about what services and supports the student's going to get. They have due process rights, so they have in the law this sort of legal process to say, I disagree with sort of the outcome here. And part of the right to the least restrictive environment, to a free, appropriate public education, so any additional costs that come with serving the student with disability does not get borne by the parent. It's the school pays for it. And part of the conversation and the decisions of the IEP team is what is the best environment for that student. And it could be often in the public schools, but it could be, as Lindsay was talking about, in a private school. In that case, when they are publicly placed in the private school, the student retains all of their rights under IDEA, which includes the free part of the free and appropriate public education, right? So the school system is still paying for that. When someone uses a voucher, though, they are considered to be parentally placed, which is the same thing as if someone just says, you know what, I really want a religious education for my child, so I choose to put them in a religious school. And the issue here, and that the report in a lot of ways goes into, is that parents often do not realize that when they use a voucher, even though it's public money, they are considered under IDEA to be parentally placed in the private school. And that is why they are giving up so many of their rights under IDEA. And so you can really think about it as, is this student in a private school through exercising their rights under IDEA or by giving up their rights under IDEA?
And then I want to leave you for a second on the segregation point, but just to build on what Sarah said, it's not as though if there was a mandate that came down for, say, the DC voucher program, that you have to comply with IDEA rights and protections, that private schools would just say, oh, okay, I'll do that, because the rights and protections and services and plans and programs that public schools have to provide kids with disabilities are enormously complex and they're very expensive. So it would significantly depress participation by private schools if they had to meet these IDEA mandates. And that's intentional. It's intentional that they don't have to meet these IDEA mandates within these programs in most cases. Matt, did you want to jump in there?
Yeah, the whole parentally placed designation conversation is quite interesting. If I recall, the GAO actually looked into how states are actually wrapping their heads around implementing the parentally placed designation. And this is actually very pertinent to voucher programs, because states don't really know what to do. They don't know how much money needs to be funneled to ensure the equitable services provision for students with disabilities, which is provision that the public district is responsible to offering services outside of the classroom for private school students, which is, when I first learned that, I thought, wow, that's pretty interesting. And it's interesting that no one really knows about this. And when you ask state officials or even district officials, they have no idea. And it's amazing that the GAO actually identified this. I think it was maybe 5 years ago.
Yeah.
Had a report.
And
Equitable distribution.
yeah.
So this is sort of the second, right, Alicia? The second GAO report out of request. And in their first one, they actually looked at this issue in particular of equitable participation. So what services are students with disabilities who choose to go to private schools getting?
So IDEA has a requirement that any
It's getting super wonky here.
I know.
Stay with us.
It's challenging, right? So any school district has to offer a certain amount of services to any private schools, any religious, any type of private school within the district boundaries. Mm-hmm. But the district retains the choice of what services it provides. And it has a certain preset amount. So maybe it says we're going to provide speech therapy services. So if you're going to this private school, St. Joe's down the road, and St. Joe's, they say to you, maybe you need speech therapy. Oh, we can, the public school is going to come in once a month and provide speech therapy. There's no IEP. There's no other rights that go to you with that. You get nothing else. But the resident district where the school is has an obligation under federal law to provide these equitable services.
To share some of their IDEA dollars with that private school.
And they retain the total choice over how to do that. But it's funny, your point is great, because the language, like in Georgia, the Georgia Department of Education, this is it's like a 30-page thing that a parent has to sign to accept the voucher dollars. And it says acceptance of the scholarship shall have the same effect as a parental refusal to consent to services pursuant to IDEA. I'm just not sure anybody would make the connection there. I think they can do a lot better job at that language. Additionally, most parents of children with disabilities may in themselves have disabilities, well, especially when we're talking about reading. And so a giant document that's like single-spaced, it can be a challenging thing for them as well. There's a lot they could be doing.
And I just want to build on, so this whole conversation, you hear how it is a bit complex, right? And to Sasha's point about schools probably don't want to have this obligation to provide all these services, especially when they're, if you're a private school, in theory, you're being privately funded, and so that was the idea, that you're not obligated to provide this because you're not being provided the funding. I just want to be really clear about the way it's talked about, though, because, again, the way this came up at the DeVos confirmation hearing, it came up again at her hearings in front of the appropriations committees. And I think there is a difference between saying, if you support using federal dollars, should students have to give up their rights to use those dollars, right? Should dollars go to schools that don't have to give students the same rights they get at public schools? And in saying, should private schools who get vouchers have to comply with IDEA? Because just remember, comply with IDEA means that they don't have to provide those rights and services because of the way the law is written. So I just want to be really clear about that. And then circling back briefly to Alicia's initial question about the money, as far as I know, there are no clawbacks, right? As far as I know, in no state law, certainly none of the federal proposals we've seen, do they say, okay, you get a voucher of $12,000 for the year, and even if the student leaves after 1 month, you don't get to keep the whole bit.
Matt, is that right?
So most programs, they administer checks. Maybe depends on the program, but most often it's 4 times a month, and it's based on their continuing enrollment there. And so if a student decides to go back into the public system, the private school will get money up until that point, into the now, and then the money will go back to the public school.
Okay. Well, I know you're probably afraid of asking a question because the last time it took us 20 minutes to answer that question. Yes, last question probably for the day.
So have you seen in any of these voucher programs, I mean, there are incentives both ways, whether they're incentives for schools or incentives maybe for public schools to counsel parents to take the voucher and go to the private school. And so I don't know, has that been observed in any of these programs, like the Florida program, where parents are counseled out of the public school system?
I would say that is a big concern that many of our parents, not most, but many of our parents do bring to us, which is, I'm in this very emotional moment with the school. I'm asking for more and more services. And so for Florida, it's just an extreme example. When they get, even if Florida's not trying to counsel them out, sending them a notice saying, hey, you could leave if you want, is like really strange. And I think is very misinterpreted by some families. It's interpreted, maybe not misinterpreted depending on how you see it, but it's interpreted as, do you want me to leave the system? Now, I haven't seen any evidence that has looked at the number of parents that are reporting they've been counseled out, but I think that parents who are in these situations they're already in very stressful situations, and it can be something that very much worries them that it might happen.
I'll just quickly say, some of the education savings accounts that have been set up in the states, those are the newer ones, but they have been advertised in the state legislatures as a cost savings to the state. They are very explicit about the fact that they will be spending less on the students if the families just take the money and go somewhere else than if they stay in the public school. And I think there's other ways that it still undermines funding for public schools, even though they claim it's saving them money, and it doesn't always actually save them money, but they are advertising it that way. And then, also to just, there was a Department of Justice investigation in Milwaukee, actually, about what was going on around sort of access for students with disabilities in the program. And I think a lot of it just comes down to the fact that as a private school, you can choose to not accept a student with a disability, and you can choose to accept them and not provide any services to them. So,
yeah, and that's certainly something that GAO found, and it's in the report as well. Well, I want to be respectful of everyone's time because we are at about an hour. So if you have questions, feel free to come up to us and ask us individually. But I want to really thank you for coming today on a really busy day on the Hill and spending a few minutes with us. And hopefully you'll help us in sharing these findings around the report. And a special shout out to Representative Cohen's office, who was very helpful in setting up this briefing and of course in requesting the report. So big thanks to him.
I'm sure we're all happy to share our contact info
Yes.
for folks want to have follow-up later as well.
Thank you so much.